The palace gates remained shut, but inside, a storm raged. On an otherwise quiet morning, Queen Camilla found herself denied entry into Windsor's blue drawing room. What she didn't know, Princess Anne was already inside, with Catherine. And between them sat a velvet-lined box that hadn't seen daylight since Queen Elizabeth's final days. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla's arrival wasn't scheduled, but that hadn't stopped her before. She was the queen consort, after all. For years now, her movements around the palace had gone unchecked, her status granting her access, privilege, and attention. But this time, something felt different. A gentle hand raised by a senior aide halted her at the threshold of the blue drawing room, a room once sacred to Queen Elizabeth herself. The aide's words were delicate but firm. Her Royal Highness Princess Anne has requested privacy. Entry is not permitted at this time. The message wasn't merely logistical, it was deliberate, and Camilla knew it. Inside, tension thickened the air. Princess Anne sat across from Catherine, Princess of Wales, a woman she had long respected for her quiet resilience, her unwavering dignity. Between them, resting like a relic of untold stories, was a small, elegant box. Its hinges creaked open slowly, revealing jewels that seemed untouched by time, a sapphire set, unlike any other. This was no ordinary royal heirloom. It was something few even knew existed. Anne's face remained unreadable, but her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she traced the edge of the necklace, the unmistakable glint of Queen Elizabeth's hidden treasure catching the light. What many never saw during the late Queen's final days were the private conversations, the moments away from flashing cameras and press statements. One of those moments, it seemed, had been shared between mother and daughter. A whispered instruction, a final act of trust. And Anne had held on to it, buried deep beneath years of silence and stoicism. But now, something had shifted. Now, she believed it was time. The weight of the decision bore down on her. She knew that by opening that box, by revealing what had been kept hidden for so long, she wasn't just honoring her mother's wish, she was igniting a conflict that had simmered beneath royal civility, a silent battle of succession and symbolism. And Catherine, though composed, knew this too. Her eyes locked on the sapphires, not with greed or excitement, but with the paralyzing realization of what this meant. Outside, Camilla paced. The denial at the door had left her shaken, her confusion turning rapidly to suspicion. She caught fragments of hushed voices through the walls. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't used to being on the outside. Not like this. Not when something was clearly happening behind closed doors, something big enough to exclude the queen consort. A handover? A betrayal? She didn't know yet. But what she did know was that the room she was barred from now held more power than any crown she wore. As the palace curtains remained drawn, what was unfolding inside would send shockwaves far beyond Windsor's walls. Buried beneath decades of tradition was a promise Queen Elizabeth made only once and never spoke of again. This wasn't just a gift. It was a final act of legacy, trust, and subtle defiance. And Princess Anne had been guarding it in silence. Until now, the hidden sapphire set had long existed as myth within royal circles. It was spoken of only in hushed tones, a relic whose existence was never confirmed but always suspected. Some said it was a personal favorite of the Queen, worn only in moments of deep reflection and never under public gaze. Others claimed it had vanished entirely after 1987, tucked away not out of neglect but out of design. Those who served closely beside the Queen recalled its last known appearance during a quiet diplomatic reception, one where photographs were forbidden, and the press, curiously, uninvited. After that, nothing. Not a glint, not a whisper. It had vanished into the palace walls, swallowed by time and tradition. But the truth was far more deliberate. What very few knew, what even fewer could confirm, was that Queen Elizabeth had made a personal decision regarding the sapphires, a decision wrapped not in protocol but in instinct. She had confided in no committee, signed no visible directive. But in a rare moment of candor, she had turned to the one person she trusted to act not out of ambition or politics, but out of principle. That person was her only daughter. Princess Anne, the stalwart royal who never wavered, had been chosen to carry a silent instruction. The sapphires would not go to the one with the highest title, but to the one with the strongest heart. Anne had carried that burden for years, not out of hesitation, but out of precision. She knew timing would define everything. If handed over too soon, the gesture would be swallowed by speculation. If too late, it would lose its potency. So she waited, watching as tides shifted, alliances hardened, and Catherine, through her quiet strength and dignity, proved herself not as a figure of fashion, but of fortitude. And when Anne finally opened that velvet box, revealing the deep blue glow of a forgotten legacy, she did so not with ceremony but with conviction. The gesture was quiet, but its implications thundered through the silence. Catherine, for her part, was visibly shaken. The sapphires were stunning, yes, but it was their meaning that overwhelmed her. They weren't just gemstones. They were a testament to the Queen's vision, a seal of private succession. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted them, not out of vanity, but out of fear. Fear of what this gift would trigger, fear of how it would be interpreted, and most of all, fear of the power it silently carried. For wrapped in those jewels was something heavier than gold, the unspoken will of a monarch and the loyalty of a sister who had waited long enough. But as Catherine cradled the heirloom in stunned silence, a shadow loomed outside the palace door. She wasn't used to being denied. Queen Camilla, arriving unannounced, expected the usual protocol. Doors opened, bows made, silence respected. But this time, it was Princess Anne herself who issued the order, "She is not to enter." And suddenly, the Queen Consort found herself powerless. Camilla had arrived with a calm exterior, but her intentions were anything but casual. Something had shifted in recent days, subtle changes in tone, strange silences at meetings, murmured names she wasn't meant to hear. She felt it in her bones. A storm was gathering, and she needed to be at the center of it. So she made her way to Windsor without notice, dressed not in opulence but strategy, fully expecting that whatever was happening behind those doors, she would insert herself as she always had. But this time, the palace did not bend. The moment she approached the entrance to the blue drawing room, the message was delivered not through stammering staffers or vague excuses, but in the form of a direct statement issued by Princess Anne. The footmen were clearly unsettled. They exchanged glances but stood their ground. "Her Royal Highness has requested privacy," they said, their voices betraying a nervousness Camilla hadn't heard in years. She stared them down, her voice sharp but steady. Privacy? From the Queen Consort? But their instructions were clear. She would not be allowed in. Not now. Not today. Behind that closed door was more than just a private meeting. It was something Camilla hadn't anticipated, and perhaps that was the true reason her fury flared so fast. She was used to reading the room before she entered it, calculating dynamics before they unfolded. But this time, the door was quite literally shut in her face, and that loss of control seared through her like a warning. Her thoughts spiraled. Why Anne? Why Catherine? What could possibly justify such secrecy and such exclusion? And there, in that corridor of opulence and shadows, memories began to rise. The years of uneasy distance between herself and Princess Anne, the frosty exchanges, the lingering glances across grand halls that said more than words ever could. Camilla had never been fully accepted by Anne. Not truly. And now, it seemed, that old resistance had solidified into something bolder. Anne had drawn a line, and she had drawn it with finality. Camilla's heart pounded beneath her calm facade. Her titles, her ceremonies, her ascension alongside Charles, none of it seemed to matter now. In that moment, she wasn't the Queen Consort. She was an outsider. And as her mind raced through possibilities, had Elizabeth left something behind? Had Anne been entrusted with a final instruction? A sickening realization began to bloom. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a moment she was never meant to witness. a moment meant for someone else. Outside, Camilla stewed in silence, but inside, the temperature was rising as Catherine uncovered something unexpected. It wasn't just jewels. Tucked beneath the sapphire set was a handwritten letter yellowed with time, but unmistakably signed, Elizabeth R. What Catherine read next shook her to her core and left Anne watching silently as the future began to change shape. Her fingers grazed the edge of the velvet case, expecting the soft lining beneath the final piece. Instead, they touched parchment, thin, folded, aged. A silence fell so sharply that even the air seemed to pause. Catherine lifted it slowly, the creases brittle with time, but the ink still sharp, and at the bottom, unmistakable and resolute, was a name that had once commanded the full weight of the crown, Elizabeth R. The late Queen's unmistakable handwriting curved across the page, elegant yet deliberate. No one had told Catherine this letter existed. No one had hinted that there was more than the sapphires themselves. But now, the truth was in her hands, and it carried a weight far greater than she was prepared for. She read the words in a stunned hush. They were not grand declarations, nor overt instructions. They were intimate, restrained, and devastatingly personal. The letter spoke of loyalty, of legacy, of a quiet kind of strength that endures longer than force. The Queen wrote of the changing world, of storms she had weathered, and of storms she foresaw. A woman of stillness in storms. She wrote a phrase Elizabeth had reserved for only one other person in private, her mother. Now, she gave it to Catherine. It was not a compliment. It was a verdict, a recognition of silent endurance, of grace beneath pressure, of knowing when not to speak and when to stand firm. The letter did not mention Camilla, not once, and that absence screamed louder than any condemnation. Catherine's hands trembled. She folded the letter back with a gentleness that betrayed the internal storm raging within her. Her eyes welled with tears, tears not of joy, but of uncertainty. She was being entrusted with something she never asked for, something she wasn't sure she deserved. The sapphires were not the point. It was the voice behind them. The Queen had spoken across time, across death, and chosen her. That choice came with a consequence, a signal the entire monarchy would soon feel. And Catherine knew the implications would not remain behind the walls of that room for long. Anne remained quiet, her eyes fixed on Catherine, letting her absorb what no one else could have understood. When Catherine finally looked up, searching for reassurance, Anne offered only truth. "This changes things," she said, not as a warning, but as a fact. The kind of fact that cannot be denied once it is uncovered. The kind that rewrites the unspoken order of power. Catherine nodded, but there was no comfort in it. Only resolve. Because the moment the letter had been read, the Queen's decision, one the world was never meant to see, had been set into motion. As the ink of the past carved out a new direction, the palace trembled not from noise, but from decisions made in total silence. These sapphires weren't just ornaments, they were silent symbols, passed only to those who upheld the crown through unshakable loyalty. And by receiving them, Catherine was being cast in a new light, one that Camilla would not be able to dim. The weight of the necklace wasn't measured in carats, it was measured in history. King George VI had gifted the sapphire set to his daughter Elizabeth, not for ceremony, but for stability. It was said that he entrusted it to her during a time when the monarchy itself stood on fragile ground during the war, during whispers of abdication, during days when nothing felt certain. She wore them not to dazzle, but to remind herself, and those around her, of the silent strength that defined a true sovereign. They were her unseen armor, worn only in the moments when she had to steady the kingdom with her very presence. And when she passed them on secretly, purposefully, they carried that same burden into the hands of the next chosen woman. Anne knew this story better than anyone. She had watched her mother revere the sapphires not for their value, but for their meaning. It was why they had never been seen during Elizabeth's most glamorous appearances. They were not for show. They were for storms. And Anne had waited, quietly, to decide who would wear them next. Not once had she considered Camilla, not because of bitterness, but because of perception. Camilla was tied to turbulence, to scandal, to an origin story too tainted for a symbol this sacred. The monarchy could not afford to lace its silent strength to a history that had already divided the nation once. That was the truth. Anne never said aloud, but lived by. Catherine, in contrast, had built her presence through silence and consistency. She hadn't clawed her way into the royal fold. She had grown into it. With each crisis, she had remained calm. With every public insult, she had responded with grace. She had never begged for status, and for that reason, she had become irreplaceable. And when Anne clasped the necklace around her neck, something changed. It was as though the crown itself had tilted slightly toward her, as though it had been waiting. That moment wasn't about fashion. It was about force. A quiet one, but undeniable. Word spread, not in press briefings, but in corridors and behind polished doors. Insiders whispered of a silent transition, a shift that couldn't be undone with titles or ceremonies. They called it a message, a signal, even a challenge. Catherine had not been crowned, but she had been chosen, and that was more dangerous to Camilla than any formal decree, because symbolism has a way of outlasting politics, and in the monarchy, it often decides the future more than law. As the jewels sparkled against Catherine's skin, one thing became clear: this wasn't just a gift. It was a declaration. The Queen Consort doesn't take exclusion lightly. And when word reached her that the Sapphire set had changed hands without her knowledge or blessing, Camilla exploded. Behind closed doors, fury ignited. What began as quiet diplomacy was now full-blown war. The news didn't arrive as an official report. It came through whispers, scattered comments overheard in corridors, glances exchanged too quickly to ignore, conversations that stopped as she entered the room. Camilla had grown used to navigating the subtleties of palace life, but this felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a shift in behavior, and then a name spoken one too many times in her presence. Catherine. Her instincts flared, sharp and immediate. Something had happened, and no one had told her. She summoned her aides with a tone that cut through marble. The moment they stepped into her private chambers, she asked the question no one dared to answer. Who authorized this? The room fell still. Finally, one voice offered the truth in fragments. The Sapphire set, long hidden, had been passed to Catherine by Princess Anne. The handover had taken place behind closed doors. Camilla hadn't been informed. She hadn't even been considered. And that, more than anything, shattered her composure. What followed wasn't rage, it was unraveling. Years of being the second wife, the outsider, the woman forced to win acceptance through smiles and silence. All of it surged back like a tide she thought she had outrun. She remembered the rooms she had entered where faces turned away, the invitations never sent, the titles handed with hesitation. She had fought tooth and nail to become Queen Consort, only to now be reminded that to some, she still didn't belong. The sapphires were more than jewels. They were a verdict, and this time, it felt personal. In desperation, she called Charles. But his response wasn't what she hoped. "This was your sister's decision," he said softly, his voice more tired than firm. He didn't offer to intervene. He didn't suggest it could be reversed. Instead, he all but confirmed it had been decided. Camilla was left holding a silence that screamed louder than any answer. The fury didn't stay contained for long. She began organizing, reaching out to trusted advisors, speaking in tones that left no room for misinterpretation. There would be consequences, there would be clarity. She would not be cast aside again, and in the quiet between her words, a different Camilla emerged, one no longer willing to play polite. If the monarchy wanted a battle fought in shadows, she would bring it to light. She began drafting a formal objection, cloaked in diplomatic language, but pulsing with fire beneath every word. The palace wouldn't ignore her this time. They would hear her, and if necessary, they would fear her. But while Camilla plotted behind closed doors, another storm was gathering, one Catherine didn't see coming. In the quiet of her private quarters, Catherine stared into the mirror sapphire necklace around her neck, weight heavy on her shoulders. The honor was immense, but the consequences? Perhaps far greater. Could she carry what Elizabeth meant? without tearing the family further apart? The silence of the room gave her no comfort. It echoed her thoughts, loud and unrelenting. The sapphires shimmered gently against her skin, but they no longer felt like a gift, they felt like a burden. Not because she didn't value them, but because of what they had already stirred. Her fury was palpable even from behind closed doors, and the palace had already begun to divide into quiet factions. Catherine could feel it in the glances, in the shifting tones, in the corridors where footsteps suddenly stopped as she approached. She hadn't asked for the sapphires. She hadn't requested Elizabeth's endorsement. But now that it was hers, she couldn't simply pretend it hadn't happened. She turned to William for counsel, expecting reassurance. But his expression told her this was not something he could soften. "This won't go quietly," he warned. "Be ready." He didn't say more, he didn't need to. They both understood that Camilla's anger wasn't about vanity. It was about what the sapphires now represented: legitimacy, authority, the intangible power passed not by titles, but by trust. Still unsure, Catherine sought out Anne once more, not for permission, but for perspective. Anne, as always, was unflinching. "That's why she chose you," she said, her voice firm. "Because you question whether you deserve it. Camilla never would." The words hit like stone. There was no room for evasion, no comfort in denial. Elizabeth hadn't picked the easiest option. She had picked the quietest strength, and now that strength had to hold under fire. Alone again, Catherine paced, thoughts swirling in conflict. She considered returning the sapphires quietly, discreetly, letting Anne take them back, letting the whole moment vanish like it had never happened. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't erase the choice. The Queen had made her decision long before her passing, and now, whether Catherine accepted the jewels or not, the signal had already been sent. To surrender them would be to reject more than a gift. It would be to refuse the responsibility she had already been entrusted with. So she stood still. She adjusted the necklace one last time, and with a breath that carried both fear and fire, she accepted not just the sapphires but everything they meant. She would not run from this. She would protect what had been passed to her not for power, but for purpose. And just as Catherine steadied her heart, a final twist emerged from the shadows, one no one expected. Hidden deep within a sealed appendix to Queen Elizabeth's personal testament was a clause known only to her solicitor and Anne. A clause that, if invoked, could alter ceremonial precedents and redefine who speaks for the monarchy when silence is most powerful. It arrived not with fanfare, but with formality, a confidential delivery, wrapped in legal silence and placed gently into the hands of the only person Catherine trusted beyond her own husband. The solicitor, grey-haired and precise, had not been summoned. He had been instructed, years before, to act only if certain conditions were met. Now, with the sapphires in Catherine's possession and the balance of the monarchy shifting, that moment had come. The sealed appendix bore the Queen's signature, and once opened, it revealed a truth more explosive than anyone had anticipated. Buried within her carefully guarded private files was a clause subtle in its wording, but tectonic in its implications. The clause outlined something the public had never seen, something few even within the palace knew existed, a reference to symbolic items of crown loyalty. These weren't jewels, they weren't trophies, they were instruments of intention, items through which the sovereign could signal their will without formal proclamation. And among them, named specifically and without ambiguity, was the sapphire set now resting around Catherine's neck. The document made it clear whoever wore it at a public royal affair, with full knowledge of its legacy, was granted what the Queen called soft ceremonial precedence. It was not about titles, it was about standing. In private councils, in diplomatic receptions, in the moments where silence held more power than speeches, the wearer would be seen as the monarch's spiritual envoy. When this revelation reached Camilla, it shattered any remaining illusion of security. She was not just left out of a private gifting, she had been bypassed in a legacy the Queen had hidden even from her husband. Camilla's fury returned with new venom, but now it was laced with fear. She realized, too late, that Elizabeth had anticipated this moment, that she had planned not only for succession but for subtle rebellion. Catherine had not taken anything. It had been orchestrated for her, layered through secrecy, and now legitimized by ink and seal. William read the clause in full, his expression hardening with each line. He turned to Anne with quiet urgency. "If this becomes public," he said, "the family won't survive it." It was not a threat, it was a warning. Camilla would never accept it. Charles would be caught between two legacies, and the press, always starved for fracture, would devour it whole. The palace, already fraying, would begin to collapse in on itself, and yet the clause could not be undone. It was not an opinion, it was a decision, a final act from a monarch who understood that true power isn't always announced. Sometimes, it's worn. But as the stage sets for a quiet but undeniable shift, the monarchy braces for the one final blow. She may not wear a crown yet. But as Catherine emerged at a private diplomatic dinner days later, draped in Queen Elizabeth's sapphires, silence fell across the room. For those who understood royal language, the message was deafening. A new era had just begun. It was not a public coronation. There were no cameras, no declarations, no grand processions, but in the world of royalty, where subtlety rules and silence speaks volumes, this was louder than any proclamation. The moment Catherine entered the private reception, shoulders back, chin raised, the iconic sapphires nestled calmly around her neck, the temperature in the room shifted. Senior diplomats paused mid-conversation. Members of the extended royal family stood a touch straighter. It wasn't what she wore, it was what it meant. The late Queen's legacy was alive, and it had chosen its vessel. Camilla's absence from the gathering did not go unnoticed. Officially, she had prior commitments. Unofficially, she had made her stance clear. She would not attend an event where her own shadow had been replaced by another woman's reflection of royal continuity. For those watching closely, her refusal wasn't weakness, it was resistance. But resistance, in this instance, only amplified the symbolism. Because while Camilla stayed away, Catherine stepped in, and with each step, rewrote the quiet order of precedence. William walked beside her, composed but vigilant. He too understood the weight of this moment. It was a risk, but it was also inevitable. The Queen's letter, Anne's decision, the solicitor's clause, none of it had been designed to stay buried. The time had come. As the evening progressed, a pattern formed. A nod here, a lowered voice there, subtle deference not demanded, but given. Catherine didn't ask for recognition, yet somehow she received it anyway. From the far side of the room, Anne watched. There was no pride in her expression, only peace. The kind of peace that comes when a promise has been kept, when legacy has found its rightful steward. Anne had guarded that sapphire set for years, waiting for the moment when duty, timing, and character would align. And now it had. The monarchy had not announced a new queen, but in that room, among those who understood the true theatre of power, the coronation had already happened in silence, in elegance, in sapphire. Outside those private walls, the world remained unaware. But inside, the tides had shifted. Catherine had stepped into something larger than herself. She wasn't challenging Camilla, she didn't need to. The legacy she carried spoke for her. It spoke of a different kind of reign, one rooted not in scandal or survival, but in serenity and strength. And while the palace remained officially unchanged, the real change had already begun, etched not into headlines, but into memory. What other secrets lie beneath the velvet and gold of royal memory? And how long before Camilla strikes back? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.